let's move on to some of these studies, because I want to break these down. And this was actually your idea, which I think is fantastic, to just talk about some of the studies that are used in plant-based circles to support their claims. And of course, we don't have a totally plant-based doctor here with us, so our views may be biased, but I want to talk about what's interesting about these studies and how they fall short, and maybe show some studies that are counter to these, or that help complete the picture of these studies. But certainly, as you were doing your vegan journey, you became such a prominent figure that you got in touch with many of the most prominent vegan physicians, and I'm sure you were able to ask them, hey, what is the science that supports these? And so let's go through some of these studies that you've been given by these vegan physicians to support this position from a health perspective. We've talked a lot about the ethics so far, and talk about what's valuable and what's lacking in these studies. Which one do you want to start with?
Yeah, so just to preface this whole conversation, what I don't enjoy is when plant-based doctors and influencers and public figures use the studies that we have available today and claim that the vegan diet has been proven to be the most optimal diet for human health, or that the vegan diet is the only diet ever shown to reverse heart disease, or these big claims that unfortunately a lot of people and a lot of doctors use to promote the vegan lifestyle. And I understand there is an ethical bias in every single one of these doctors because they're vegan for ethical reasons, but it doesn't justify manipulating the data and misinforming the public about this whole thing. I mean, you got Neil Bernard going on London Real and comparing eating meat to smoking cigarettes, or eating cheese to taking heroin. I mean, how are parents of kids who are being fed meat and animal products going to feel like if there's this physician telling them that they're essentially promoting lung cancer in their in their babies and children? It's just a counterproductive and a false statement. And a lot of these people, I feel like, need to take responsibility for the actual evidence that we have. And the reason why I wanted to do this with you is not because, I think that there is no value for vegan diets. I still believe that some people can be optimally healthy on a vegan diet until I see, my own family and friends failing. This is my perspective, but I do also know that there's a lot of people who cannot and who do experience side effects, right? So, but the most important thing I want to get out of this conversation is just going through the data and going through the main points that we have, the main studies and the most cited studies by all these professionals, and kind of tell people what they do say, what they don't say, what they may suggest, what they may not suggest. And I think me and you both can agree that the nutrition science today is far from giving us a kind of clear picture of what is 100% optimal and what is not 100% optimal. And, it's not a reflective of, the truth, the objective truth out there.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think that there's a lot of nuance here, and we do our best to show both sides of it, and to show what's valuable about these studies, and to show their shortcomings, and then to show studies which can complement these and perhaps suggest that some of them are extreme claims. Now, I like what you're saying there, and I think we'll get into a lot of this if we have time, that I've seen the same thing, that many of the vegan doctors will make claims based on very poorly done studies without control groups, or based on epidemiology. But should we start with some of the randomized controlled trials? I think these are probably the ones that are most interesting to both of us, because they are randomized and controlled. And it's important to point out that there are randomized controlled trials of vegan diets which do show benefit. Now, I would like to talk about these for you, or with you and the audience, and show what's valuable about them, and then what the shortcomings are and what they're really showing us. Because unfortunately, like you're suggesting, many plant-based advocates would say, look, the vegan diet has clearly been shown to do this. And it's like, well, let's talk about the nuance here. Right. So often the nuance is lost. So it's really, I think, does a lot of disservice to this. So do you want to start with the plant-based diet intervention improves beta cell function and insulin resistance, or is there another one you want to start with?
Yeah, let's do that one.
Okay. So I'll pull it up here on the screen. This one is quite an interesting one. Now, there are too many of these studies to really talk about in this podcast without making it 3+ hours. But we'll go over some of the randomized controlled trials. This one was interesting to me. What did you think of this one, John?
Well, this is a very, this is one of the most cited ones, and just the Physicians Committee of Responsible Medicine and Neil Bernard and his work is probably one of the most cited studies and kind of randomized trials in the vegan community, to my knowledge. They do show some benefits, and they show that the intervention group actually improves while the control group doesn't. But they're like any kind of study, no matter if it's a randomized trial or epidemiology, there are definitely some big holes. And a lot of times when you just hear, oh, Neil Bernard has a randomized controlled trial, and you think, well, randomized controlled trials are pretty high up in the hierarchy of evidence. They're pretty high power. It must be amazing. But the fact is that you can have a lot of nuance and a lot of question marks even after randomized controlled trials. It's not the gold standard be all end all of nutrition and science. But there are some good things about this study. And I think what stood out to me the most of this study was that the people who were fed a low-fat vegan diet, although their LDL dropped, they also dropped other markers that are probably not beneficial for cardiovascular disease. Even though this was for diabetes, we can't ignore all other consequences of dietary interventions, right? So along with getting benefits for diabetes, they also showed some markers that I think may be problematic for cardiovascular disease, like higher triglycerides or fat in the blood, and lower HDL levels as well, which was pretty interesting, which I was not expecting on a low-fat vegan diet.
And as you and I were reviewing a lot of these randomized controlled trials on vegan diets, it was a pattern that we saw repeatedly, that on a low-fat vegan diet, I think almost every single one of the RCTs that you and I had emailed about, there was an increase in triglycerides and a decrease in HDL. So this study is interesting. Like you said, there were 75 participants randomized to a low-fat plant-based diet or to make no dietary change. So right there, what we're comparing, just so people understand, is a low-fat plant-based diet. Low-fat is important, as we'll see in a moment, to basically the standard American diet. Right? So this is interesting, right? And as you and I agreed, a low-fat vegan diet may be better than the standard American diet. What's interesting for me about this study is that these are people who do not have diabetes. So these are people with no history of diabetes, and they looked at the beta cell function, which they estimated using the HOMA-IR model while fasting. Now, some interesting things really jumped out for me at this one, which were that changes in glucose-induced insulin secretion correlated negatively with BMI changes, but not with changes in visceral fat. Beta cell function and insulin sensitivity were significantly improved through a low-fat plant-based diet in overweight adults. And if you look at the actual data, what you'll find here is that when they did this study, so I know this is a complex chart, but I'll just show people. So this is the control group. This is the intervention group, and both groups did reduce calories. In many of the other randomized controlled trials that you and I will talk about in this podcast, the vegan group reduced calories, but the control group did not reduce calories, or the vegan group reduced calories more. A lot of these trials with vegan studies are not designed to be isocaloric, which introduces a very confusing confounding variable, and we can talk about why based on another study in a moment. But in this group, the baseline group started out with 1,900 calories a day. They went down to 1,582. The control group, 1,851. The intervention group, 1,450. So both groups reduced calories at about the same. But what you'll find here, and this is actually why I want to highlight this, is that the visceral fat volume, something I've been talking about a lot on my podcast recently, which is the amount of fat inside the peritoneum and the stomach, did not reduce in the control group, but it did reduce in the intervention group. So this is actually a really striking finding. If I were a plant-based physician, I would look at this and go, this is really cool. A plant-based diet clearly improves visceral fat volume, which it does appear to in this study, over the standard American diet. Now, over the standard American diet. And if you look here at the bottom, you can see that the HOMA-IR, which is a calculated score, doesn't really change. It actually goes up, which is a bad thing in the control group, and it goes down in the intervention group. So the investigators, I think, are selling this story properly. They're saying, look, a low-fat vegan diet decreased visceral fat and improved insulin sensitivity. Now, the next part of which portion of the vegan diet did this is the most important part. I think that Neil Barnard and the folks in the plant-based community would say this is because of the exclusion of animal products. But there are multiple interventions here. It wasn't calories, but the thing that you and I highlighted was that if you look at the polyunsaturated fatty acid intake in these two groups, the control group decreased a little bit, but the intervention group decreased their polyunsaturated fatty acids much more than the control group, because remember, this is a low-fat vegan diet. And all of these RCTs that you and I found were low-fat vegan diets, meaning that as part of this intervention, this is what's so complicated about nutritional studies, these people are not only removing animal products, they're also removing vegetable oils. So we could draw a lot of potential conclusions. We can make hypotheses based on this study. You could say, hypothesis number one, the removal of animal products leads to reduction in visceral fat. Okay, that's a hypothesis. Hypothesis number two, the removal of polyunsaturated fatty acids leads to visceral fat volume loss and insulin improvement. Now, those are both hypotheses. And the problem with these studies is when we do a nutritional study, we come out with like 5 different things that we then have to sequentially test or subsequently test. And the problem is that these are rarely tested. Now, what's pretty cool here is that there has been an interesting study that really tests this exact question. And I emailed this to you right before the podcast, so I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but is it okay if I just share this one real quick, John?
Go for it.
So if we are asking the question, is it the calorie restriction or is it the meat, which isn't quite what we're asking in this study, because that was really the polyunsaturated fat or the meat, then this is a great, interesting study. So this is actually in humans, and the title is Potential Effects of a Reduced Red Meat Compared with Increased Fiber Intake on Glucose Metabolism and Liver Fat Content, a randomized and controlled dietary intervention study. So this is a cool study because it kind of advances this question. And they'll show here epidemiological studies, which you and I will talk about, suggest that increased red meat is associated with a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. But as you and I and the listener will know, just because it's associated doesn't mean it causes it. So they did an interventional study over 6 months, and all of the groups decreased their calorie intake by 400 kcals. The control group just had a caloric deficit, and there was a group that had no red meat, and there was a group that increased fiber. And at the end, what they found was striking. Glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity improved, and body and visceral mass decreased in all groups. In all groups. These changes did not differ between the groups. And this is looking at glucose sensitivity, tolerance, body visceral mass, essentially the same outcomes as the previous study, and their conclusion is striking. Our data indicate that caloric restriction leads to a marked improvement in glucose metabolism and body fat composition, including liver fat content, and that when you take meat out, it did nothing else. There seems to be no additional beneficial impact of reduced red meat and increased fiber intake on improvement in cardiometabolic parameters. So this starts to really ask some major questions about these vegan trials. Is it the removal of red meat, or is it the reduction in calories in some of the other RCTs that we'll see? And in this first study, is it possible that it's actually the removal of polyunsaturated fats? Because there are a lot of studies like this one, the second one that I just showed, that say, hey, you can get improvements in glucose parameters and loss of visceral fat when you're still eating meat. So I thought this is such an interesting takeaway here. What do you think about all this, John? Does this make sense? And do you think this?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is, I think, when it comes to getting favorable health outcomes, being on a caloric deficit, losing weight in general is going to, be better. I believe that if people did a, randomized trial, just like that one, and included a McDonald's group that was only eating McDonald's and junk food all day, but were still on a 400, calorie deficit, I believe that maybe they wouldn't get as great of a result, but they would still see improvements. So a calorie deficit, makes a huge difference. And a lot of times people gloss over that kind of, fact as well.